Let's view the world from the perspective of an 18-year-old. You were 1 year old when the 2008 financial crash happened, 4 years old when the Arab Spring took place, 8 years old when Jeremy Corbyn was elected leader of the Labour Party, 9 years old when the Brexit referendum took place and Trump was elected in the same year. At 13, a global pandemic took place. At 15, the war in Ukraine started. And at 16, the genocide in Gaza begun. Now you're 18. Welcome to a world on fire. To join me today, I've got Khaled, the London organiser of the RCP. Welcome.
Thank you.
And in all of that time, we should say austerity has been taking place, right?
Yes, it's been a permanent feature of your life if you're 18, and I think it's left a real big mark on the youth. Something that can't really be understated, because we have seen a major attack on youth services that people would have taken for granted.
Yeah.
Trips to swimming classes, youth services that were there for well-being, mental health support. All of this has really been slashed in the last 15 years. And so we've seen a lot of our social services die a death of 1,000 cuts, really.
Yes. Yeah.
And it's very stark when you look at youth centres in particular.
Yeah.
When we were doing some research ahead of this, we were looking at the statistics on this question. And over the last 14 years, there has been over 1 billion worth of cuts, with one report estimating 73% cuts in real terms since 2010. In London, where we're recording, there's been a 44% decline in youth service funding over a decade, which means a major loss in centres, but also a major loss in staff. And how does that compare to what the government has been spending more and more money on?
Yeah, war and militarism, right? I mean, you think £1 billion, it's an astronomical amount of money. But then by comparison, just this year alone, we've spent £62 billion on defence.
Yes.
And we spend £100 billion servicing the debt.
Yes.
So it's, when you put it in those terms, you can really see where the priorities of the ruling class are today.
Yeah, 100%. And I think we wanted to do this episode by focusing on the real material impact that austerity has had on the youth, on Gen Z.
Yeah.
And if you look at the closure of youth centres across the country, it's more than 2/3 of council-run youth centres that have shut down. These would be spaces where kids would go to socialise, kids would go to develop themselves, right?
Yeah.
As individuals, as human beings, as soon to be adults ready to take on the world.
Yeah.
And in fact, with the major shutdown of these centres, the Institute for Fiscal Studies talks about how this is associated with poor grades at school, especially for poorer kids from disadvantaged backgrounds, but also just this general feeling that a lot of young people have of society going backwards and not really being able to find their place.
Yeah.
A lot of people in small towns would actually end up getting jobs as support workers for young people, and thousands of these jobs have been cut.
I think this point about what is being cut are places where young people develop themselves, socially as adults, figuring out what they like is really important. And if you look at a specific example, Birmingham, in 2023, the Birmingham City Council declared bankruptcy.
Yes.
Which is an extraordinary thing to take place. Birmingham is the second largest city in the country. And yet it found itself in this position where it had to declare bankruptcy. And so it had to implement huge cuts. And one of the major areas that they cut were the arts, cultural services. In particular, ballet schools were cut, galleries were cut. One example, I mean, this is the figures say it all for themselves, right? This is Icon Gallery, saw its funding from the council fall from £300,000 in 2012 to under £20,000 in 2023.
Yeah, shocking.
I mean, that drop it's just decimated the entire thing. And other cultural projects to do with Black History Month, dance festivals, all of this. This is where they go to first.
Yes, yeah.
And it's all of that stuff, and that has a massive impact on how young people experience life.
Yes, yeah, in a very big way. And it's not as if the hard cuts are over.
Yeah.
They're projecting to make even more cuts to all of these facilities in the next coming year. I was reading before that it's going to go from 20% cuts to opera houses and ballet schools to 100% in 2026.
Yeah.
So when you use the word decimation, you're quite literally correct
Yeah.
in this particular case. And it does have a very big impact, I think, on how young people first experience life and what's possible in front of them as well.
Yeah, aspirations, dreams.
Yeah, dreams of becoming an artist.
Yeah.
And I think for so many people, that's becoming an exclusive jaunt for the rich, right?
Definitely.
You need a family that will be able to basically back up that kind of lifestyle. And so working class kids are shut out of it more and more and more.
Yeah.
And we should say as well, Birmingham is a very stark example, but it's estimated now that in the next 5 years, 40% of councils could go bankrupt in the UK. So
Yeah.
if anything,
This
this
is coming everywhere.
yeah, this is a harbinger of what's to come.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that has had a real impact on this kind of demoralization that a lot of young people feel, or a kind of directionlessness, if that's a word.
Yeah. I think so.
But I think another very big factor, to go back to what you said at the beginning, is this growing inequality in the world. And I think for many people, it became so clear during the pandemic that we don't all suffer the same, right?
Yes, and especially for 18-year-olds, right? I think if you're 18 now, you'd be 13 when the pandemic began, which is also an age where you're probably actually starting to think. You can think politically at 13. I've met 13, 14-year-olds who've got ideas politically about the world. And the pandemic, for all people, young and old, in school or in work, was an extremely strange time, which felt like, I would say, limbo for a lot of people. It affected people in different ways, right? A lot of people were at home, maybe they were on furlough, not having to work. A lot of working class people were still working and going out, especially in essential services and things like this. But the main point I want to get across is because it created this weird, almost static limbo in people's lives, it gave people the opportunity to think in a different way. And therefore, inequality became a much more obvious aspect in society. I really remember at that time the way people responded online to celebrities, for example, who for some bizarre reason, and I would say also, I think the pandemic was a bit of the beginning of the end of how people kind of accept how socially acceptable it is for celebrities to just be uber wealthy and display it all the time and to flaunt it, because I think there has been a bit of a cultural shift in society. There is a growing anti-rich mood that does get expressed towards celebrities. But yeah, I really remember in the pandemic this video going viral of all these celebrities singing that stupid Imagine song.
Imagine all the people
living for today.
I think I missed this.
I won't. Don't know. You were reading a book probably. I was watching these stupid videos, and the response to it was absolute fury. Because why? Because it was celebrities, basically super rich people, sat in their massive houses with all of the space they needed to run around or do whatever, just saying, let's all stick together. And that was also what the ruling class tried to implement, right? At the start of the pandemic. And you could argue it worked at the beginning because people were fearful. It was like, okay, we've all got to sit down at home and we've all got to do this for the greater good. Until people realized, well, hold on a minute. It's not the same. Actually, my experience and the experience of the ruling class is completely different. And you're doing quite well out of this, whilst I'm not. You know, the pandemic was a time for a lot of people which is marked by tragedy. Like, people lost loved ones, couldn't go to the funerals. There were all of these rules. And then at that time, the Tory government became completely entangled in sleaze and corruption. And so I think the pandemic was a real turning point in the kind of politicization that's taken place globally, but also especially for young people, because they were 13, 14, 15 when that was taking place. And that's had a deep impact on the psyche of how people relate to the ruling class and politicians. I think this idea of corruption is was like the story then of the pandemic, especially in Britain.
One set of rules for politicians and another set for the rest of us, right? I mean, need I mention Partygate? Which of course I think, infuriated so many people,
Mm-hmm.
people that wouldn't have even considered themselves political,
Mm-hmm.
people that don't vote.
Yeah.
But to see, the Tories legislating one thing and then
Yes.
acting in a completely different way just shows how removed they are from the ordinary day to day of working class people's lives. And
Yeah.
that did infuriate a lot of people. And you're absolutely right that the pandemic did not affect everyone equally.
Yeah.
I mean, you mentioned this in the pamphlet that you produced,
Mm-hmm.
just how some people got exorbitantly rich during the pandemic.
Yeah.
The top 10 richest men doubled their wealth, whilst it actually plunged millions of families into poverty.
Yeah.
A lot of women found it very difficult to get back into work after the pandemic. We know that women bear the brunt of austerity measures and have
Yes.
done for the last 15 years.
Yeah.
But when you talk about scandal and sleaze, I mean, remember Matt Hancock?
Unfortunately.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's almost cartoonish just how evil this man was.
Yeah.
And when people think of the pandemic, they think of PPE
Yes.
and they think of contracts literally being handed out to your landlord.
Yeah.
Or not your landlord,
Your pub's
your pub
landlord.
landlord.
Yeah.
That's it.
Which is almost worse. You're down the pub and you start chatting, and it's
And here's
just
30 million.
Yeah. And I think I like that you said it was cartoonish, because I think sometimes when you think about the levels of corruption around the Tories and the ruling class, you can almost exaggerate it. But then when you look at what happened during the pandemic, it's like, oh no, this is literally what they do.
Yes.
They just give their contracts to their friends that they knew at university or that they're having an affair with.
Yes. And that's the craziest thing. It
Yeah.
wasn't the cronyism that brought that man down anyway.
Yes.
Hopefully we don't show a clip of that.
No.
But there was another question that I think got brought into sharp focus from the pandemic, which was who gets to decide what is essential?
Yeah.
And in many industries, it was the boss
Mm-hmm.
that decided for one reason or other why it was essential for their workers to come into work. And so for a lot of families, especially working class families, life didn't really halt. You would make a dangerous trip to work every single day on a bus, being around other people, and then when you would work in quite close proximity to other working class people, and then you would go home. And so working class people were risking their life and their family's livelihood, really.
Yeah.
And I think that did leave an impact on a lot of people, because we talk on the show a lot about hypocrisy, right?
Yeah.
I think one of the biggest hypocritical acts that the government ever encouraged was get outside your house at a certain time and bang pots and pans
Oh
for
my
essential
God.
workers, right? Remember
Yeah.
that?
Yeah.
And then, what was it, 2 years later when they asked for a pay rise, all of a sudden they become the enemy.
Yes.
I think a lot of people, especially young people that saw their families go through that experience, some
Yeah.
people losing jobs, maybe seeing your mum not getting back into work afterwards,
Mm-hmm.
to then have gone through all of that, it must have left a very big mark on the psyche of young people.
Definitely. And, we've described how the pandemic impacted the working class. And obviously, at the same time, if we think about these 13, 14-year-olds, this is something that is written about a lot. We were talking earlier about personal development and how austerity has damaged that. To add to the limitation on personal development, there is the pandemic itself, which takes young people outside of school and having to do it online in this kind of really distorted way, which was very, very difficult for teachers, but then also for the students themselves.
Yes.
And all of that means that it adds to this general culture, I think, that exists, particularly amongst young people today, of a social malaise. One of the points that I've been making on a lot of my talks about why you should be a communist is that a lot of young people, they can't maybe pinpoint it exactly, but there is this feeling that there's a kind of a sickness in society and a pessimism, a sense that, things are bad and I don't think they're actually going to get better. Yeah. And all I can really do is think about what are the small things I can do in my life to just get through. And so it's basically an individualism as well. There's a kind of this, horrible rat race, not in a sense that like, how far can I make it to the top? It's not that, it's the opposite. It's
Race
like
to the bottom.
It's how do I, stay afloat in this society? financially, yes, when they actually get to an age where they're having to like live independently, although that's not really possible. But also from like a kind of a mental health point of view and just living. But you see a lot of people online document this in many different ways. A lot of young people online talk about how much they'd like to leave Britain, and how like just get me off this island, get me off this rainy hellscape. On TikTok, you see all these videos of people just showing their living conditions. Like, yeah, this is my horrific flat that I live in. All of this kind of stuff. I think that it's just this sense that there's very little that we have, and we're just clinging on bit by bit.
Yes.
And it just produces a real sense of doom and gloom.
Yes.
And it's not just a product of their minds. This is the point. It's backed up by the real economic hardship young people are facing, and the fact that they do not have opportunities on the job market, number one. We discussed this in a previous podcast, right, about how like many of the jobs on Indeed, for example, they're not even real job advertisements, right, that they're giving out. It's like AI harvesting data.
You go for a grad job and you stand a chance of 140 to 1.
Yeah. And it came out today or yesterday that unemployment generally in Britain has reached a record high in 4 years. I read that this morning. But youth unemployment specifically is also growing.
Yes.
And has reached 12% in the UK. And so this is why we have to say, like, this sense of doom and gloom that a lot of young people feel, it's not random. It's a reflection of the fact that actually, economically speaking, it is objectively very difficult for young people to progress in this society.
And now it's being recognised by people like David Cameron.
Yeah.
There's that clip that's gone viral of him recently, where he talks about us inheriting a massive debt, a massive pile of debt.
I wish Gen Z in Britain and France and across Europe and maybe even here were more militant about arguing that government was mortgaging their future. I would definitely advise them to spend less time singing from the river to the sea and less time worrying about trans rights and more time worrying about the extent of government debt, because ultimately we are building up debts for the future.
But before we unpack that, I think it's just very interesting to trace how the tone of people like him has changed so drastically in a matter of 5 years. I mean, another former leader of the Tory party, Ian Duncan Smith, back in 2021, announced to Parliament, I won't read it in his voice, "My goodness, what prospects lie ahead for us young people now." That's almost identifying himself as a young person. It's kind of strange. "To be out there buccaneering, trading, dominating the world again." I think it couldn't be starker, the contrast. And I
Buccaneering.
think buccaneering, what the hell does that
Dominating the world again.
Yes.
This is also part of that like delusional Tory wing of the Tory party that were like, Brexit will bring us rule Britannia. Yeah.
Yes, that
Anyway,
kind of nonsense.
Sorry to interrupt.
But it's interesting for David Cameron to come out about this, because all of the social malaise we've just described is a product of the never-ending austerity, which his government was the architect for.
Yes, David Cameron specifically.
Yeah, him and George Osborne.
Yeah.
The two of them, I remember when being quite young. I'm not 18 anymore, but I remember being quite young, and the phrase that was being used a lot at the time was tightening our belts, right? This kind of national campaign to bring down the debt and cut the deficit. And yet, after 15 years of it, nothing has changed, apart from, as we pointed out in previous episodes, that the austerity measures that Starmer is going to have to introduce at some point, maybe in the November budget, is actually going to make the cuts the Tories carried out look like a picnic.
Yes, exactly.
So, in fact, the crisis has only become more and more aggravated. And so we can say to someone like David Cameron, what is your solution to this? Because you talk about this collective struggle or burden that we now have.
Yeah.
But as you yourself admit, this is affecting the youth more than anything. The solution that you tried to use was austerity.
Exactly.
And now it's almost like a repeat prescription that the Labour Party is giving, and to no avail. It is not changing the tide of the fortunes of British capitalism one bit.
Yeah. And what I find funny about that clip is, him saying you should care less about Palestine and all this. It's like, actually the austerity that he has implemented has created the anger in society, for which Palestine has now become a lightning rod. Because as we were just discussing, the money that they are spending on militarism and war, it's reflected in the anger that people now feel over Palestine. And so it is actually connected. And it's that artificial separation that the ruling class constantly try to do for political issues that doesn't really work anymore.
It's not working at all. And, you know, something we hear very often is, well, all generations have had problems. What makes you so special?
Yeah.
But when we were preparing for this, I mean, you were mentioning to me this crazy thing you heard on LBC about housing.
Yes, the buying a house today is akin to how difficult it was in the Victorian era.
Yes.
That's a clip that was coming up on LBC.
And something that we've mentioned recently, and I found it in a TUC report. This was the headline: "Never mind the Great Depression, we're now experiencing the longest pay squeeze since Napoleon marched across Europe." The biggest pay freeze, or the biggest cut to real wages in the last decade. You'd have to go back to the 1800s to find that as well.
Yeah.
So clearly, objectively, something is going very, very wrong.
Yeah, definitely. And as I say, like the ruling class, and well, actually, as you say, like David Cameron has mentioned this, and a lot of mainstream media, if you like search anything to do with young people, there are a lot of articles that come up describing this problem in Gen Z and like but it's coming at it from a perspective of like, why are Gen Z like this? Can't they just kind of grow up almost or get over it? Which is totally at odds with the actual conditions that they're experiencing.
Yes, in a big way. And there are plenty of statistics you can find out online of just the ways in which the cost of living crisis is affecting young people, the prospects of buying a house, for instance, the insecure job market that we've talked about before. And obviously all of this is feeding into this silent epidemic of the mental health crisis, which is affecting young people in a very strong way. I mean, it's estimated that 2/3 of Gen Z are have experienced mental health issues. And that can be anything from anxiety to depression to panic attacks, at a time where the facilities or the resources to look after the youth are being cut to the bone. I mean, it's almost become a joke when you talk to people that are on waiting lists for counseling, for therapy. And there is this almost this readiness to hand out medication, which also almost acknowledges the fact that there just aren't enough specialists to speak to young people about the problems that they face. And I think what we should say is this really reveals the sickness that is there within society. One statistic I found was in December 2024, nearly 1.7 million people were waiting for mental health care in the UK. And that was up from 1.3 million in March, just earlier that year. So we've seen this with the privatization of the NHS, but for a lot of people coming onto university campuses now, all of the mental health provisions that were there in the past, the care support packages and this kind of thing, have been cut away. And of course, it is having a very big impact on the youth. And there are all of these very shallow and superficial explanations, which I think capitalism really benefits from. You know, this, instead of saying there is a sickness in society, there is this attempt by the ruling class to kind of individualize the problem, to make it sound as if you don't feel well or you don't feel like you have direction, it's on you.
Yes.
It's your problem. You've got to privatize that. When actually there are systemic reasons for this to be, why this is the case. People are feeling more and more isolated. They feel frustrated and they blame themselves for the lack of opportunities. But as we've described already, it's objectively capitalism that is failing an entire generation. And of course, it only benefits the capitalists for you to believe that it's actually your own fault.
100%. The ruling class take a really superficial view of this mental health crisis, which is very real, but then reflect it in this very, very distorted way. I would say to promote a culture war.
Yes.
A culture war also against young people and against Gen Z, and try and present there's this intergenerational conflict of if you should be tough like the older generation is.
Yes.
Which is totally false, and it's very, very pernicious. But it's really promoted by people like Piers Morgan. Also, I think Jordan Peterson, who I would say was kind of one of the first iterations of this culture war. He's less popular now because he's gone a bit weird. I don't know.
I was going to say he's crazy.
Oh, yeah, there you go. But remember his book that went really famous, and it was like make your own bed,
12 rules for
12
life.
rules for life, and it was all about as an individual, you can suck it up and you can change things, right?
Yes. Don't blame other people for your problems.
This is it. Don't blame other people for your problems. Don't blame the government for your problems.
Yeah.
Don't blame the state for your problems. And that is the kind of cultural. I would say Charlie Kirk was also a part of this. You know, that it's you as an individual, and then they aim it specifically at young men as well, especially, and they whip it up in this kind of false, masculinity kind of idea. But they basically argue that, there's this ideological softening that has taken place towards Gen Z, and that's why they're doing all this. So they're on an ideological battle to undo it. And there's this clip from Piers Morgan that's actually from a couple of years ago that I think it, exemplifies this really, really well.
Snowflake generation, they hate being called snowflakes. Of course they do. They hate everything. And they're frightened by everything, and they're offended by everything, and they're sort of, anxiety rates are going through the roof. And the reason is because they've had it so easy. Let's be completely clear about life today. In recorded history of planet Earth, it's never been a safer time to be alive. There are fewer wars than in recorded history. People are living longer than in recorded history, and they are living in a healthier way than in recorded history. There is less poverty than in recorded history. On almost every single box you would want to tick, which should make you feel happy about life, is ticked. This is the best time, statistically, to ever be alive.
So in that clip, which by the way is from 2019, he's arguing that there's never been a better time to be alive. Even at that time, that was a crazy thing to say,
Yes.
as we'd already had years of austerity from the Tories, which had decimated youth services and a lot of horrors. But in any case now, it's a symbol of the same idea now that, no, there are objective horrors that capitalism is producing all over the world, and specifically towards young people. And what they are trying to do is battle with a growing consciousness, you could argue, in people that is seeing the world and seeing how, or seeing rather the system, I should say, and seeing how it is responsible for people's problems. But they're constantly promoting this idea that it's only you as an individual who should be trying to deal with this kind of stuff, and you're false for trying to blame the world. And the weird part of this is, whilst they do this, they present themselves as the underdog.
Yes.
And as though that is not the dominant idea in society. I mean, that was Charlie Kirk's whole crusade, and the whole crusade of his wife afterwards has been, we will continue Charlie's mission. It's like the mission of the ruling class, you mean, that billionaires fund him to talk about every single day.
Yes.
But it was a poisonous culture war that says, you're not allowed to be angry about your problems. You've got to fix them as an individual.
Yes, yeah. And actually, on the other side of the spectrum, on the left, I think there are kind of similar myths about the youth. For a long time, there has been this suggestion out there that the youth are just too pacified to really do anything.
Yeah.
And I think this was kind of exemplified by Mark Fisher, who wrote the book Capitalist Realism. I remember when I got to university, one of my friends bought it for me and was like, this book is going to change your life. The book actually just made me feel quite depressed. Because the general thrust of it is that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to end the end of capitalism. And it kind of it taps into something that is present in meme culture, this kind of nihilism, this kind of cynicism as well, this irony.
Yeah.
It's part of that kind of quote unquote postmodern condition, right? Rather than joke about things and be kind of ironic, rather than actually fight to change anything, that would be too embarrassing. That'd be too gauche. But actually, I think those ideas really do not reflect the way in which young people feel today.
Yeah.
I can't remember when that book came out, maybe just after 2008.
Yeah.
At a time where, people were saying to the left, well, where's your revolution then?
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly.
You were saying at the beginning, if you're 18 today, you were 4 years old when the Arab Spring happened.
Yeah.
And then there's been a litany of revolutions afterwards, huge movements of the youth. I mean, even in this country, there was a huge youth movement back in 2011 against the hike in tuition fees.
Exactly.
We see the youth now at the forefront of all of these struggles across the world. But I think it's kind of similar to what you were describing with the kind of right-wing lie of, well, a lot of the left depend upon this idea that the most radical thing you can do is change yourself, right?
Yeah,
To
yeah.
look inwards in times
Yes.
of strife.
Think differently, basically.
Think differently, purge your mind of prejudice and bad thoughts, and basically adjust yourself or acclimatize yourself to the oppression and
To the
exploitation you
capitalist
face,
system. Yeah.
which is not the most radical thing
No.
that you can do. I mean, there was this quote that I got from his book. I
Mhm.
mean, see if the audience can make any more sense of it than I can. What must be discovered in a way out of the motivation/demotivation binary so that the disidentification from the control program registers as something other than dejected apathy, end quote. So deprogram your mind
Mhm.
from all of the bad things that happen and work on not feeling apathetic. Well, I mean, when you look at the youth today, they're not apathetic whatsoever.
Exactly.
And it feels almost like this idea that all the youth need are kind of new self-help gurus isn't really reflective of what the youth are looking for now when they're taking to the streets. And I think this almost, the way that I see Marxism cutting across these lies from both sides, basically, of the political spectrum, is Marxism does not teach you that you are powerless in the face of
Yeah.
external forces or that you are helpless to do anything. In fact, it shows that collectively you can do something, you can find your place in history, and that will be when you represent the interests of your class.
Yes.
You're pushing for revolution, and I think more and more people are becoming open to these ideas because they are not pessimistic for the future.
Yeah, this is exactly it. The most empowering thing you can do is almost to look outside of yourself.
Yes.
I would say. And that is what Marxism is all about. I like to speak personally, I think becoming a Marxist, and I would say joining the RCP has been the most empowering thing I've ever done. And I think that's true for all comrades who join. Not just because of like us as individuals, but especially at this moment in time where we have seen in the last couple of years a number of examples of youth mass movements. I was talking earlier about this culture war that the ruling class promote, and they used people like Charlie Kirk, and I think part of the reason why they were doing it was almost to stop these mass movements
Yes.
that were coming about, right? What did we see towards the end, actually, around 2019? First of all, you had the climate strikes movement, which was a global movement led by Greta Thunberg. Like millions took part in that all over the world.
Hundreds of cities calling for what? System change, not climate change.
Not climate change. And then on top of that, in 2020, you saw the huge Black Lives Matter movement, which in America saw in America it was like the biggest social movement basically to take place. But in Britain, it also had a huge impact. Hundreds of thousands of people out on the streets. Again, with a very clear slogans and ideas coming out of it, which is that the system is the problem, right? So whilst all of these things, that's one thing that we have to say, like we've referenced the mental health crisis, this kind of, individualized idea that exists in culture. But the flip side to that has been this huge collective struggle and politicization and radicalization that has taken place amongst young people, and it is really powerful. And the ruling class were terrified about it when it happened, and they're still terrified about it. I mean, Jesus, we've not even spoken about Palestine, which isn't, we've just, my voice sounds a bit funny perhaps, because at the Palestine demonstration, there were 600,000 people there, of which there was a huge number of young people.
Yes.
I mean, there's so many different examples of actually this collective struggle. And everyone, when you're in that, you feel empowered.
Yes, you feel inspired. And
inspired.
Just on the BLM point, I think it is something that terrified the ruling class in a very big way. I remember when it reemerged in 2020, there was a moment where Trump was hiding it down in his bunker with the Bible.
Yeah.
Because he was fearful that, in his words, Antifa were going to come and basically burn the place down. Why was he fearful of that? Because tens of millions of Americans were involved. There was majority support, passive support amongst the entire population. That is very significant. When they burnt down the police station in Minneapolis, the majority of Americans surveyed said that was a justified thing to do.
Yeah.
That is an act of insurrection.
Yeah.
That's absolutely incredible.
Yeah.
And people were talking about defunding the police, right? Where did that come from? Communities realizing that the police does not serve their interests, it doesn't stand for them, and that they would be better protecting themselves. And when you start to doubt an institution like the police, you're doubting the capitalist order, right?
Yeah.
A very important and central part of the state. And so if you say that, a lot of people began to doubt the order which requires the police to defend private property in the first place, right?
Yeah.
It had a hugely radicalizing effect. And on Palestine as well, that demonstration was fantastic
Yeah.
over the weekend. We had a very big block. We had 400 communists out.
Yes, we did.
Yes, you did an amazing job with all of the chanting.
Thank you.
A lot,
So did you.
a lot more stamina than me. I'd burn out after about 5 minutes. But what was very interesting was hundreds of people were coming towards our block. Why? Because we were connecting the issue of a free Palestine to the issues affecting working class people at home, to austerity, to militarism. People, we were
Yes.
drawing in a very, very big crowd, which again shows how these issues are being connected up by people that enter into these movements themselves.
Yeah, I mean, Greta's an example of that as well.
Yes,
I mean,
yeah.
she came from the climate strike movement. And actually, I remember when the climate strike movement was taking place, one of the things we said is we should think about the impact of a generation of young people growing up when their first entrance into politics is through the idea of a strike or a mass school student strike, but what that will do to consciousness and the memory we have. Like, we spoke last time about the memory of the French class struggle, right?
Yes.
It's okay, the climate strikes are not the same as May 68, right? But in a very, very small way, it's about if I was 14 and I went out on a mass school strike walkout because that's how you confront something, that has an impact on how, and those people will be on the Palestine protests today,
Yes.
were on the BLM protests, I'm sure, and will be a part of whatever is next about to crop up.
Yes.
And I think it's very important. That's part of why we have this podcast, is to uplift this aspect of the world that is taking place right now, because there is not enough attention given to it.
Yes. Yeah, in a big way. And I think, as we've said in past podcasts, a defining feature of life today for young people is instability.
Yeah.
And for a lot of Gen Z, I think the oldest you're allowed to be to fit into that category is 28 or 29. Not too
Yeah.
sure.
Some of us are just at the edge, just on the edge.
But so for a lot of Gen Z, you're entering into work. And I think there has been a mass questioning about work and the balance. Getting the balance right between life and work is something that a lot of people talk to me about. A lot of my friends have these kind of questions. And what I think is quite stark is how much burnout there is from the youth at
Yeah.
much earlier ages, right? You know, if your parents worked in factories and this sort of thing, you'd have maligned hands and this sort of thing. But 20-year-olds falling ill and taking days off work because they are sick, because they're being made sick through their conditions of work, is becoming a more and more prominent feature. And it reminded me of what Marx wrote about alienation,
Yeah.
this grueling work where you don't find it fulfilling and actually you don't view yourself as the same person when you're at work. And I wanted to read a section of Marx's writing on alienation because I think it captures it very well. First, the fact that labor is external to the worker, i.e., it does not belong to his intrinsic nature, that in his work, therefore, he does not affirm himself but denies himself, does not feel content but unhappy, does not develop freely his physical and mental energies but mortifies his body and ruins his mind. The worker, therefore, only feels himself outside his work, and in his work feels outside himself. He feels at home when he is not working, and when he is working, he does not feel at home. His labor is therefore not voluntary but coerced. It is forced labor. It is merely a means to satisfy needs external to it. I mean, it's a very, very powerful passage, and it also shows this lie up that we're told often about how free we are, you know, buccaneering spirit and all of this.
Yeah.
In fact, a lot of people realize that the only freedom you have is the freedom to sell your capacity to work to a capitalist.
Yeah.
And that you don't really get to dictate the terms when the job market is as fierce as it is. But I think what's so absurd about this today in 2025 is we're living at a time where there has never been more wealth in society. I mean, they're talking a lot about these new frontier technologies, about AI, about robotics, about quantum computing. We have all of this science and technology at our fingertips. And yet, for the majority of people, it's not lessening the burden of work. In fact, people feel like they're in a race against the machine.
Yeah.
And this alienation, I think, is really marked when you think about the big modern factories that exist all over the globe. It actually shows where all of these innovations end up going. I mean, if you work at an Amazon plant, they have AI-powered cameras that check whether or not you're too tired.
Yeah.
That have this kind of facial recognition stuff.
Yes.
There are modern tracking devices that are given to people. I mean, all of this stuff is being wasted on basically making life or making work more and more intolerable for working class people.
Yeah.
So it's no wonder that there is such high levels of burnout amongst young people.
Yeah, it's dystopian, and the stuff that comes out of Amazon warehouse, even the conditions, not being allowed to look at another, colleague as they're walking down the corridor, all of this stuff. It's really dystopian and it's really scary. And I think it's important that we talk about this idea of burnout. We started by talking about personal development, because I think there's this misconception that communists and Marxism are all just about fighting for improvement of wages, for
Yes.
example, or conditions at work. And obviously, all of those things are vitally important, right? And we do struggle for that. But actually, in truth, Marxism and socialism would be about liberating the working class, liberating us from these horrific conditions so that we could develop almost spiritually, right? And actually become real humans who can form real social relationships with people. Look, socialism, and this is, one of the most common questions we get asked, and I've been asked, I'm sure you've been asked, in Marx Society meetings, on a store, wherever it is, like, what would socialism look like? And always we should explain, we're talking about, first of all, dramatically reducing the hours in the working week, right? Raising the wages of a whole layer of people, using all this technology that you've just described for the betterment of humanity, using the scale that Amazon has, the organizational capacities it's been able to develop,
Yes.
but for what society needs and not just, random products or however Amazon uses it. Using the mass resources we have in the interests of the majority of people and the working class, so that we can liberate ourselves from the drudgery of labour that holds people back and prevents people from living a full, dignified life.
Yes.
That is what we are fighting for. That's what Marxism is about. That's why Marx spent a lot of time, even in he doesn't just describe and talk about the economic conditions. He talks about how that impacts people.
Yes.
And distorts their life and their ability to think and feel.
Yeah.
That's so important, and it's actually kind of the most essential part of our struggle.
Yes.
It's just that we recognize that it's rooted in the economic system,
Yes.
which is why we have to confront that first collectively.
Yeah.
Because that collective struggle also is what allows people to feel that power, or get a glimpse of what that power could be like.
For sure. For sure. I mean, one of the biggest lies we're taught under capitalism is that we can develop ourselves as individuals.
Yeah.
But in fact, your skill set as a worker becomes narrower and narrower. Even just kind of the horizons of what's possible and where you can be is narrowed. You feel hemmed in from a very early age. We were talking earlier about the lack of access to culture of young people, the opportunities of living life as an artist, or taking up and developing hobbies as well.
Yeah.
More and more that is not really seen as possible. And that's exactly what Marx is talking about when you say it kind of distorts the human form. It almost, capitalism reduces us to this existence of living almost just like an animal would, right?
Yeah.
Not really being able to think beyond your next paycheck and being worried all of the time about paying bills and this sort of thing. What you were saying reminded me of something Marx wrote when he said there are two key reasons why a revolution needs to happen. The first is economic. You need to expropriate the commanding heights of the economy in order to begin to plan society and the economy in the interest of social need. That is true. But there is this cultural, spiritual element of a revolution where people become aware, yes, not only of the power that they hold within society, the fact that they can run society for themselves, but they can actually engage with society, right? They can engage in social life. They can develop themselves in
art.
In art and culture. And this is very important. Like, it's a crude caricature to say Marxists are just caring for bread and butter issues, right?
Yeah.
In fact, there's something we fight for far greater than that. And a question we're often asked is, well, what would the incentive of this society be? I mean, from what we've described, the incentive would be very clear, in my opinion, that you would work, if we were to take power in Britain, we would work as quickly as possible to automate as many jobs as we possibly could in order for people to live for pleasure and not live to work. And on that basis, people would be able to properly develop themselves as human beings. The working week could be drastically reduced rather than it feeling like new innovations in technology are going to take our jobs. It would actually be to the benefit of all of society. So I think there's a very clear incentive for that.
Yes, definitely. And this, everything we've described, obviously we've been talking about Britain, but this feeling is all over the world because capitalism is all over the world and it's producing the same horrors for young people all over the world in some other countries in a much more extreme way than Britain, right? I mean, Britain is one of the advanced capitalist countries and so the conditions of life in Britain are like higher than in other places, even though we've described how they're getting worse. And actually, you know, something we've spoken about in the past is often what can cause revolutions is not just conditions getting worse, but it's the constant change or like the dramatic changes in life that pushes people to revolt. But yeah, just to give an example, as this is the World on Fire podcast, we mentioned before in Madagascar, this movement's taken. I mean, in Madagascar, 79% of people live in poverty, right? And there's been this huge inequality. And so young people have just led this huge movement that in the last few days has led the president to have to flee through like the French, actually, because like, you know, French colonialism still plays a role. You know, he was airlifted out in a helicopter by the French, and because of this huge movement led by young people. And that's just another inspiring example of this process, this feeling, this like yearning all around the world in young people that is this it? Is this what this system has to offer us? Because if so, I don't want to live like this. And we think that feeling in a slightly different way, but fundamentally, it exists in Britain as well.
Yes, for sure. And I think this insecurity is churning up consciousness all across the globe. People are looking for a radical alternative. And in and through struggle, people are beginning to realize their own strength. And this is where we come in as the Revolutionary Communist International. We're trying to build a force up all across the world in order to smash the existing order and show people that it's through struggle that you can draw out real optimism in these bleak times. It's through the struggle for socialism that we can actually liberate the whole of mankind from the drudgery of work that we've been describing in this episode. And it reminds me very much of a quote that from Trotsky, where he is talking about what man would look like under socialism. He says the average person could be raised to the heights of a Goethe or an Aristotle or a Marx. And he says, from these ridges, new peaks will rise.
That's beautiful. Now I feel more inspired. Well, I think we can leave it there.
Okay.